Energy disruptors. Please welcome to the stage Susan Cain, co-founder and chief revolutionary at Quiet Revolution.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to be here with you today. We're going to now talk about a very different kind of energy for the next 40 minutes. We're going to talk about the power of introverts in this decidedly extroverted culture of ours. And I thought that I would start off by just telling you a quick story, because people often ask me how it is that I came to be so passionate about this topic in the first place. And I'm sure this is true for many of you, too, who are really passionate about the things that you do, that you can trace the roots of that passion early in your childhood. And that's how it is with me, so I'm going to tell you this story about the time that I was 9 years old. And I went off to summer camp for the first time. And my mother packed for me a suitcase full of books, which in our house was a very natural thing to do if you were going off to the woods for 8 weeks. I came from this very quiet and scholarly family. And I had this vision that I was going to get to camp and be surrounded by my new friends, and we would be sitting and reading our books in our matching pajamas. But I got there and was confronted with a very different prospect, which was a counselor who greeted us and told us that she was going to teach us a cheer, which we would then be performing for the rest of the summer. And the cheer went like this. It went, R-O-W-D-I-E, that's the way we spell rowdy, rowdy. Rowdy, let's get rowdy. So I could not figure out for the life of me, why were we supposed to be so rowdy? And why did we have to spell this word incorrectly? But I just did the cheer, I kind of grew to like it, and I did my best approximation for the rest of that summer of a rowdy and gregarious camper. And I did that then through also the rest of my childhood and into my young adulthood as well, so that I actually went and practiced law on Wall Street for almost a decade before I became the author that I had always longed to be. And this was in large part because I was so accustomed always to kind of not paying attention to my own preferences of how I wanted to spend my time, and instead trying to be this kind of more out there, alpha, extroverted person that we all get so many messages in our schools and in our workplaces we are supposed to be. And that's really why I'm here with you today, talking about innovation in the energy industry and how to set up our workplaces in a way that really work for everybody. We've got to understand this dynamic. Now, for many introverts, they're just constantly kind of not using the best of their energy and instead trying to be somebody else. But I just kind of want to give you a quick idea of what it looks like when people are really doing what they're meant to do. And so I'm just showing you now 3 well-known introverts. We've got Albert Einstein on the left, who famously said, "It's not that I'm so smart, it's that I stay with problems longer." And then J.K. Rowling in the middle there, who, of course, gave us the Harry Potter series, which came to us through a very solitary, thorough, and methodical kind of process. She first got the idea for these books when she was sitting alone on a train, gazing out at a field full of cows, and suddenly had the idea for this boy wizard. But she didn't kind of rush off and just dash pen to paper. She spent the next 5 years carefully plotting out the world of this wizard, and only when she was done with that process did she release it to the world. And then, of course, on the right there is Warren Buffett, who's well known really for working really well with his managers and so on, and also for sitting down for hours at a time poring over financial documents. And it's that aspect, it's the solitary work, it's the deep thought, it's the sitting for hours at a time and plotting things carefully that we're not making we're not paying enough attention to right now in our rush towards innovation. I think we kind of miss out on that aspect. Now, it's also important to remember, right, that we need both kinds. We need the yin and the yang. And so this is a picture of a young Steve Jobs and a young Steve Wozniak. And when we think about the growth of Apple and the innovation that that was, we tend to think of the moment that Steve Jobs entered the story. And we forget that Apple really began when Steve Wozniak, who was a very shy and solitary engineer, would sit night after night by himself in his cubicle at Hewlett-Packard, where he was working at the time on calculators. And he had this dream of a personal computer that anyone could use. And so he would sit there night after solitary night until he had finally had his eureka moment and designed this prototype. And it was only then that he brought it to his friend Steve Jobs, who was kind of like, holy moly, look at what we've got here. We've got to turn this into something big. And so it was the two of them together that created Apple. And when you look around at many of the companies that are doing really well, you see these kinds of yin and yang pairings. And sometimes they happen consciously, and sometimes they happen unconsciously. But we need to make sure that they happen. Okay, now, I want to get each of you thinking about who you really are, and where do you fall on this introvert-extrovert spectrum. And in my book, Quiet, I've got this personality test that I developed based on some years of research. And we don't have time right now to get into that whole test. So we're going to get at this in a more unorthodox way. I just shared with you a story from my childhood that I think tells you a lot about who I really am. I'm going to ask you now to break up briefly into groups of 4 and share with your group a story that tells who you really are. And then we're going to ask each group to select the most poignant and personal and private of these stories and share them with the room as a whole. And from this collaborative group process, a larger truth will emerge. And I'm just kidding, you guys. I am just kidding. We're not going to do any such thing. But with apologies for having put you through those brief moments of discomfort, because some of you were clearly like, how can I get out of here right now? Hopefully it makes the point that we introverts kind of feel forever obliged to be participating in these kinds of group exercises, the utility of which often eludes us. And this is not to say that introverts don't like working in groups and like working for the greater good, because we do, and we know this from management research too. But it is to say that we like the kind of work where everybody gets to go off and focus on their piece of it, get into a state of deep thought and deep flow, and then come back to the group to share in some kind of coherent way what it is that everybody has come up with. And we're going to talk a little bit later about ways of doing exactly that. But first, I really do want to get you thinking about who you are. And I promise from now on, no more trick questions. So I'm going to ask you just to consider that you have been at a party. Imagine it's a fun party with company you truly enjoy, and you've been there for about 2 hours. And ask yourselves, how do you feel at the end of those 2 hours? Now, if you're an extrovert, and many of you will have heard this before, and this is where we have a very different take on energy for this particular talk, because if you're an extrovert, it's as if you have an internal battery that is getting energized and recharged by those 2 hours. And so the end of the 2 hours comes and you're looking for more. And if you're an introvert, it doesn't matter how socially skilled you are, and it doesn't matter how much fun you might have been having, but your battery is draining of energy, and you are starting to wish that you were home in your pajamas. And so this idea of the battery, this internal battery that we all have, it's a fantastic kind of easy metaphor to use. I also want you to understand that it's only a metaphor for what's happening neurobiologically, because the thing is that we are all wired differently. Introverts and extroverts, we have different nervous systems. And so the nervous systems of introverts react more to stimulation of all kinds. And this means that we feel at our most alive and switched on when there's less going on around us. And extroverts have the opposite kind of nervous system, where you react less to stimulation, And that means that for you, you're in your sweet spot where there's more stimulation coming at you. That's when your nervous system is at the right place. And for you, when you're spending too much time on your own, let's say, or there's just not enough inputs coming at you, that's when you start to feel kind of listless and sluggish. I'm showing you this photo of babies to make the point to you that these differences have been tracked in babies as young as 4 days old. Scientists have done studies where you give sugar water to these babies to suck on, just after they're born, and you find that the babies who salivate more in response to the sugar water, which shows us that they have nervous systems that react more to stimulation, those same babies are more likely to be introverts as they grow up. Like they're always going to be reacting a little bit more to everything going on around them. Now, we tend to think of all of this as having mostly to do with how do you show up at the company holiday party? How do you behave in a meeting? But it's actually much broader than that. So for example, the psychologist Russell Gein did a famous experiment where he gave math problems to introverts and extroverts to solve, and he found that the extroverts did fine. Oh, and he had background noise playing while they were doing the math problems. And he found that the extroverts did fine while the noise was loud. And the introverts did much better when the background noise was softer. And so for those of you who are thinking, okay, how do I design my workspaces? What should my teams look like? How do I make these next great steps happen? I want to say to you, this research is really profound because it's telling us that there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all environment. There's no such thing. If you want your people creating at their best, interacting with each other at their best, you have to situate them in environments where they can choose the amount of stimulation that's coming at them at any given time. And you should start paying attention to this in yourselves because regardless of which way you tend to go, you're going to notice now that your craving for stimulation fluctuates throughout the day. And if you start paying attention to this and taking a quiet walk when you need to tone it down and calling a friend when you need to tone it up, you can be in your sweet spot a lot more of the time. Okay, now, one of the questions people ask me probably the most is, okay, how do we show up for each other in meetings? I have these meetings and extroverts are doing all the talking and the introverts are doing none of the talking and I want to hear from everybody, and so what should I do? And this is a topic that we could talk about all day long, but I'm just going to give you briefly, I'm going to give 2 tips for the introverts in the room and 2 tips for the extroverts in the room. And before I do that, let's just get a quick show of hands. How many of you would consider yourselves introverts? Okay, and how many extroverts? Okay, it looked like maybe slightly more extroverts. There are some of you who didn't raise your hand at all, and it may be because you're ambiverts, which is the word that psychologists have coined for people who are kind of in the middle of the introvert-extrovert spectrum. And I often think that you have the best of both possible worlds. So, okay, but what do we do about meetings? Tips for the introverts first. Before you even get to the meeting, think about what you want to say, think about the point you want to make, and give yourself a nudge to speak up early, which is probably not natural to you, but you need to know that the ideas that get advanced early tend to become anchoring ideas. And even more important than that, emotionally, the people who speak early become kind of emotional centers of the room, and other people will start directing their eye contact to you and their energy to you. And if you wait too long to speak, the opposite thing happens, where emotionally you kind of drift more and more to the margins of the room. And it's not to say you can't get back there from the margins. You absolutely can. But it's easier to start plunk in the center. So just try that, see what happens. Second, introverts. I hear this all the time. People will have an introverted colleague or boss, and something good will happen in the team. And they think that their colleague or their boss doesn't care, because we might feel really enthusiastic about stuff, but we tend not to show it so outwardly. And we've got to give ourselves a push on this one. And I'm going to tell you now a story from my life, to give you a sense of what this looks like, kind of in everyday life. So I am married to an extrovert, and he has, how do I say this? he's got a really lovely way of expressing enthusiasm. And when I first met him, I had just left my career as a Wall Street lawyer, and I had decided to become a writer. And I thought I was going to write a memoir in sonnet form, because why not? And so at the time that we met, I had written a few poems. And he was about to publish a best-selling memoir of his experiences as a UN peacekeeper. And we had been on a few dates, and very nervously, I handed to him some of the poems that I had written for him to take home. And later that evening, I got this email from him. Can you all see it on this side of the room? Oh, shoot. Gosh, I don't know if I can do it justice, but it's this email of incredible encouragement, and I'm sorry that you can't see it from where you are. And that was when I first started writing. And then when Quiet came out and it first hit the bestseller lists, he was jumping up and down, he was ululating, he was planning a book party, and I was just as excited as he was, it being my book, right? But my version of expressing that was more like, this is great. It was much more muted. And so what I always find with him is that that's all well and good when something good happens for me. But I always have to remember that when something good happens for him, I have to give myself that extra little push to show that enthusiasm more outwardly, because that's the way he is programmed to see it. And then he, of course, by the same token, has to remember that I never express it quite the way he does, and that's okay too. And so you see how, with all this stuff, like having awareness of it and getting to a point where you've got enough comfort with each other to talk about how you express these things can do away with what can become years of misunderstandings. And so I would urge you to do this not only in your marriages, but also in your teams. Okay, now 2 tips for the extroverts. You guys can stand to curb your enthusiasm a little bit. And I will invoke the example of Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook, who's a very strong extrovert, and who actually hired a coach to help her to speak up less at meetings, because she really sincerely wanted to hear what other people had to say, and she's so irrepressible that she kind of was taking over it and not hearing from everybody. So little tweaks, just start paying more attention of how much everybody is speaking and make the tweaks that you need to even it out. Extroverts, I would also say to you to know that you're not going to get the best of an introvert's heart and mind in an all-hands meeting. You're going to have them, and you want to know the good ways to do them. But when you really need to know what's going on, try to schedule a one-on-one and let the person know what it is you want to talk about in advance. Because introverts want to process before they show up to talk with you. Okay, now, what else should we know? I'm going to give you a few more tips and then welcome Holly back to the stage. Okay. First thing is what to do about your comfort zone, because you all might be coming away with the idea that I'm saying to you, be who you are, always be who you are, never do the uncomfortable thing. And I would not say that at all. I think we all need to step outside our comfort zones all the time. But the key is to do it strategically. So you want to figure out, what are your personal projects? What are the things that really matter to you in your work and in your life? And in the service of those personal projects, that is the place to go, that is the place to go outside your comfort zone. And then when you're done, come back and give yourself a pat on the back and go and close the door to your office or do whatever it is you need to do to take a break. When we talk about discomfort, I also want to talk about fear, because I know you all have your fears, regardless of whether you are open about them. Let me just take some water. So my fear had always been a really deep-seated fear of public speaking. And during the years that I was a Wall Street lawyer, I gritted my teeth through it. And then this book was coming out that I had spent 7 years working on and that I was absolutely passionate about. And I really, really wanted it to happen. And so I didn't want my fear to stand in the way. And so I embarked then on what I called my year of speaking dangerously. And if you look at the psychology of extinguishing fear, the way that you have to do it is to expose yourself to the thing that you fear in really small doses. So you can't begin by giving a TED Talk. So in my case, I started out by going to a seminar for people who had this particular fear. And the way it worked, on the first day, you would show up, you would say your name, sit back down, declare victory, you were done. Then you'd come back the next day, or the next week, and this time you would go to the front of the room, and people would ask you some easy questions, like where did you grow up, and where did you go to school? You answer the questions, sit back down, you're done. And little by little by little, in this way, you can become accustomed to the thing that had previously, for whatever reason, horrified you. And so I'm sharing this with you because any fear you've got, you can do this. And if you don't have these fears yourself, I am sure you've got super talented colleagues and mentees who do, and you can use this to help them. Okay, the next thing for you to know. I'm guessing, how many of you have read the book Good to Great? Okay, so a lot of you. And so you know this was a book by Jim Collins that was based on a landmark study that he did looking at the top best performing companies in the country at that time. And he wanted to figure out what set these companies apart from their more mediocre peers. And he found that every single one of these 11 companies was led by a CEO who was described as having two characteristics. The first one was a fierce sense of will and dedication to that company and its projects. And the second one was that each of these CEOs was described by their peers as quiet, unassuming, low-key, soft-spoken, and even shy. And I think if we're honest, we will say to ourselves that that's not the constellation of traits that we normally think of as belonging to an effective leader. And yet these were the traits possessed by every single one of these people. And if you've been looking at this stuff and this data for as long as I have, it's not as surprising. And the reason is that introverts tend to get really focused on and passionate about one or two or three things in their lives. And so if you get introverted colleagues or mentees or whatever who are really into what they're doing and very talented, these are the people who may not be seeking leadership for its own sake, but they will end up building expertise and inspiring trust and acquiring knowledge. And they end up ascending to leadership positions through this kind of alternative channel, you can almost think of it as. And they end up becoming very effective leaders. So I would ask each of you, just as you're sitting here right now, to think to yourselves of at least one person you know, and it could be you, could be someone in your companies, but someone you know who is super talented and who we might be dismissing as being not a so-called natural leader. And what could you do to get that person where they need to be? What are the fears that you could help them extinguish little by little by little over time? What are their ambitions? Because we often mistake quiet people for being less ambitious when in fact there's no correlation. What could we do? And then finally, I'm just going to end exactly where I began, which is with that suitcase full of books that I took with me to summer camp all those years ago, and that I still have with me now. Every time I travel, I've got it in my hotel room right now, a suitcase full of books. I was saying this a few weeks ago to a group at Amazon who I was speaking to, and when I came down off the stage, this whole gang of engineers came up wanting to talk to me very anxiously, and so I was interested to hear what it was, but they just wanted to know, why are you not using a Kindle? But I do have my suitcase full of books, and I want to ask you to think to yourselves about what is the thing that you carry around with you in your suitcases everywhere you go. And of course, I mean this metaphorically, not necessarily literally, but really, like, what is the thing that matters so much to you that you take it with you everywhere, in your hearts, in your minds. And for the introverts in the room, it's probably pretty natural for you to identify those things, but then to kind of hold them close and guard them carefully. And that's fine. But I hope you'll take those things out every so often and show them with the world, share them with the world, because the world needs you and it needs the things that you carry. And for the extroverts in the room, I think for you it'll be relatively easy, let's say, to take those things out and grace us with your joy and enthusiasm. But to all of you, I'd like to say, may you all have the best of all possible journeys, and may you have the courage to speak softly. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Would you like to take a seat down over there? What a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Susan. I can't tell you how excited I've been for this session. If you haven't already watched Susan's TED Talk on the Power of Introverts, it's one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. It's brilliant. If you haven't devoured Quiet yet, as I have, there'll be an opportunity to get a book once we finish this session during the break. Susan, I wanted to ask you, when you launched this book, it felt like we awoke as a global community to introverts for the first time. And I wonder how it is we could have gone so long without understanding this dynamic that's in every workplace, every home, so many relationships. How was it this had gone unacknowledged for so long?
I know, it's such a funny thing, right? I think it's because there has historically been, and mercifully it's starting to go away now, but there has historically been a stigma associated with introversion. And I will tell you, I really felt this during the years that I was researching and writing my book. You know, when I first started this project, I thought I was working on this highly idiosyncratic project that I would be lucky if a few people were interested in. And during the years I was writing it, I would go to dinner parties, let's say, and people would say, what are you up to? And, you know, there was a kind of weird silence that would fall over the room when you would explain you're talking about introverts. Like,
people didn't know how to follow the conversation.
They didn't know how to follow the conversation, and there was a discomfort around it. And then my book came out in 2012. I gave a TED Talk right after that, literally probably about 3 weeks later. And I came off the stage, and for the rest, I was one of the first speakers at TED, and TED is this week-long thing. And after that, I was literally mobbed for the rest of the week by all these mover and shaker people coming up to tell me secretly that they're introverts too. And they were like, don't tell anybody, but you were talking about me also. And so I think that's why we didn't know.
So there's a stigma we're having to destigmatize with time.
Yeah, and the letters that I get from people are always like, wow, I thought I was the only one who felt this way.
Yeah.
And it's kind of crazy to me, because I walk around the world and, you know, millions of people are saying, I thought I was the only one who felt this way. So.
And I imagine for introverts, it was, wow, someone's talking about me, I'm not the only one. And for extroverts, it's probably this, oh, wow, there's a whole other way I have to think about leading, and the culture and the dynamic I create in the teams and the organizations I'm a part of to make sure I'm harnessing the whole capability of the people that are in the room.
No, I think that's right. And this is probably as good a time to say as any. Like, I love extroverts. Like, I deeply, sincerely love extroverts.
One. You're married to one.
Exactly. And I say that because I think that people can sometimes mistake this message to be like up with introverts and down with extroverts. Sure. And of course that's ridiculous, right? Yeah. So I think it's really a question of like figuring out collectively what is the right language for us all to understand this, so we just can, you know,
work together,
enjoy each other a little more, and work together.
And I think that came through in your presentation with the tips on both sides of the coin of how do we do a better job in how we show up, and how do we do a better job of how we invite the contribution of others.
Yeah.
I wanted to quote you. I thought it was really interesting in your book. You talk about and you argue that we've excessively and misguidedly in many ways kind of favoured the extrovert. And you make the comment, we make them our bosses and our political leaders, and we admire their self-help books. I wanted to ask you, now we're in an age of social media where popularity and personality seem to have just taken things to a whole other dimension.
Yeah.
How do we kind of check our own bias when it comes to favouring one disposition over another, or letting the noisiest dominate, given the platforms are even more available?
Yeah, well, it's funny because when you talk about the online platforms, it's a bit of a mixed bag because there are many people who will tell you that they'll call themselves online extroverts and offline introverts. So like anybody can post the photos on Instagram and on, right? Like you don't necessarily have to want to be out and about all day long. So there is that. But I think that role models go such a long way, and so taking a moment to think, okay, who are the people in my family, who are the people in my work life, who are the people out there in the world who I really admire, and you start to pay attention and you'll realize there's lots of introverts and extroverts among them.
Yep.
And I think that's kind of the deepest root to our heart, or the quickest way to our hearts, let's say, when we think of individual people who we already love and admire.
I wanted to ask you about the extrovert-introvert topic and dynamism in the context of disruption. It's a huge part of the conversation that we're here discussing.
Yes.
When it comes to disruptive ideas and change and innovation, in that context, what do we need to be conscious of from an introvert and an extrovert lens?
Yeah, okay. Well, we are living right now, I believe this deeply, we are living in a cultural moment that I call the new groupthink. We're under a kind of collective delusion right now that all ideas emerge from a very collective and gregarious process. And I think we really need to pull ourselves back from that. And yes, of course, we definitely want the exchange of ideas, and we want the collaborative moments for sure. But we desperately need to bring back moments and spaces for deep think and deep flow and deep work, and a lot of that happens in private. When psychologists have looked at who are the most creative people, and they look at all different fields, they look at art and in science and in business, like across the board, they almost always find that it's people who are at least, even if they're not natural introverts, they're introverted enough that they can withstand solitude, because you cannot do really deep creative work without solitude. You just can't do it.
Yep.
And we see this like with Jeff Bezos at Amazon, where I'm sure many of you will have heard the way he runs meetings there is he has people spend a week in advance preparing like a really deeply thought out memo about what they're going to talk about at the meeting. Then everybody shows up, and for the first half hour of the meeting, they all sit there silently reading this thoughtfully prepared memo. And only then do they start to discuss it. And I think that's the right direction.
I really like that line. You've got to be able to be introverted enough that you can withstand solitude.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because it really flies in the face. You talked about the extroverted bias. We also sometimes in innovation conversations have an execution bias. We've got to get it done. We've got to get it done now.
Yeah, sure.
And so that creating the time and space and valuing deep think, quiet reflection. It's probably more of a scarce commodity than it ever has been right now.
It's a scarce commodity, and it's about to grow ever scarcer because, of course, we have a generation that's growing up with the minimal attention span, digital era, and then it's happening to all of us also. I mean, even for people who didn't grow up that way, like me, I see it happening to my brain as I'm doing this, just like everybody else. So it's increasingly scarce, and it's something that we need to pay really conscious attention to. So you can use techniques like the Jeff Bezos one. You can do things like decide if it works in your organization. Every Tuesday we're not having any meetings, and we're not even going to interrupt each other much on Tuesdays. That's the day where we're scheduling it for deep flow. The best thing probably is to get together within your teams and figure out how collectively can we create these spaces for all of us to do it. It's the introverts who are probably emotionally hungry for it, but all of you need it, whether you're introverts or extroverts.
Yeah, great advice there, I think. And one of the other topics we've been touching on today is kind of continually casting our eyes to the future. What does this look like in 10 years and 20 years?
Yeah.
When you look at the dynamics that we've got now, how do you think extroversion, introversion will shift in leadership and in the dynamics of our teams when you cast forward, thinking about that next generation to 10, 20 years down the line?
Well, I think that it's going to keep on improving, kind of like this, and it's almost like an asymptote where it's going to take a really long time to actually, or never, I don't know, reach perfection. But I think of it something like incorporating women into the workplace the way we should be. You know, we're so much better than we were 30 years ago,
Yep.
and we have so far to go, and I think it's something like that.
So it's kind of broadening our diversity and inclusion conversation to think about different styles of working, thinking, as well as gender, culture, you name it.
Yeah, and really putting it consciously on the calendar. So when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we should be thinking deeply about temperament. Like, I'll tell you, like, I first started thinking about this, I think for real, when I was a Wall Street lawyer, and I was really interested in women's issues. And so I was always thinking about, like, how do people behave at meetings, and who's taking the floor, and so on. And I started to realize about halfway through, when I discovered the Myers-Briggs test that we were talking about backstage.
The awakening that provided for both of us.
Yeah, I started realizing that the only language that we had in the law firm where I worked for talking about these questions was the language of gender, and to some extent the language of ethnic diversity and so on. But it seemed to me that the biggest factor that was influencing these issues was introversion and extroversion, and there was no vocabulary for it. There was no space to talk about it. We need to really put this front and center.
Ladies and gentlemen, I could talk to this woman for hours. We've been given such a treat having Susan Cain here. And do not worry, we're going to have her back for a panel discussion this afternoon, so plenty more opportunity for questions. Please, during your break time, send them through with the hashtag EDU2018. But can you join with me in thanking Susan for a phenomenal presentation?
Thanks, all of you. Thank you.